The rain hadn't let up all morning. It fell in steady sheets against the tinted windows of the black SUV crawling down Route 37, slicing through the upstate New York woods. Inside, Ethan Calloway loosened the knot of his tie and leaned his head back against the leather headrest. He was late again. His son Oliver would be sitting in the school office, legs swinging, cheeks puffed in that expression of quiet disappointment Ethan had grown all too familiar with. He glanced at his phone. 4 missed calls from his assistant, 2 emails flagged urgent. He silenced it. The town of Maplewood hadn't changed much. It was still tucked away behind forests and worn signs, the kind of place people drove through without stopping, but Ethan wasn't here by choice. He was here because the city had begun to feel like a wall closing in. After the acquisition and the media fallout after the divorce, after Oliver started biting his fingernails to the quick, he knew something had to give. So when his father's old summer house became available, he bought it without a second thought. He hadn't expected to stay more than a month. That was 2 months ago. Pulling into the gravel parking lot of a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since 1973, Ethan turned off the engine. He didn't remember the name of the place, just that the last time he'd been inside he was 16 and covered in mosquito bites, ordering milkshakes with his brother. The bell over the door jingled as he stepped inside, brushing rain off his shoulders. The place was warm, filled with the scent of frying bacon and coffee, and scattered with the kind of people who weren't in a rush to be anywhere else. He hesitated just inside, then moved to a booth near the back. A few seconds passed before he heard a voice, soft but clear. "You want coffee or something stronger?" He looked up. The waitress had a pad in one hand, a pen tucked behind her ear, and dark hair pulled into a low bun. Her apron was smeared with flour near the pocket, her name tag reading Sadie. Her eyes were an arresting gray-green, not quite matching any memory he could place, but something about her felt familiar in a way he couldn't pin down. Not the kind of familiar that came with past meetings, but the kind that struck deep in the gut. "Coffee," he said, slow to respond. "Black, and maybe a grilled cheese if it's still before noon." "You're in luck. Breakfast ends at 10:30, grilled cheese lives all day." She smiled then, but it was guarded. She jotted the order down and left without asking questions, which was something he appreciated. Ethan exhaled and stared out the window, the rain now a foggy smear against the glass. His mind should have been on the investors, the meeting he was skipping, the stack of paperwork waiting on the dining table back at the house. But instead he found his thoughts drifting to the waitress, the subtle strength in the way she moved, her voice, that familiarity again. Sadie returned with his coffee and plate. "You look like someone who used to come here summers ago. Ever go fishing out at Cedar Pond?" He blinked. "Yeah, my dad had a house near there, Ethan Calloway." Her eyes didn't widen, didn't narrow. If the name meant anything, she didn't show it. "Thought you looked like a Calloway. You've got the brow. My mom used to say you all scowled even when you were happy." He smiled despite himself. "Sounds like your mom knew us well. She was the hostess here when I was a kid. Didn't get much past 60 before her heart gave out, but she knew everyone in town." He wanted to ask her more, but a couple waved her down and she turned quickly to help them. Ethan watched her go, the quiet flicker of something stirring inside him. Not attraction exactly. Not yet. It was more like noticing the color of the sky right before a storm. The next day he came back. Oliver was in school and the quiet house felt too quiet. He told himself it was just a good spot to work, away from the emails and noise. But when Sadie brought his coffee again, something in her smile lingered longer than before. They spoke more about small things, the kind that didn't matter unless you really listened. "Sadie right?" he asked at one point. She nodded, short for Sarah Diane. "My mom was Southern, couldn't choose between her sisters' names, so I got both." "Any family still in town?" Sadie's hand paused as she wiped the edge of the counter. "A sister, kind of, don't talk much, complicated history." He didn't press, didn't offer his own history, which was tangled in custody schedules, broken promises, and the quiet guilt of watching his son flinch at loud voices. They kept talking. Days passed. He started timing his visits around her shifts. She brought extra napkins for Oliver, learned he hated melted cheese but loved fries dipped in mustard. She laughed when Ethan muttered about corporate nonsense and offered advice that was sharp in its simplicity. "You ever think maybe you're building something no one asked for?" she said once, chin in her hand. Every day. Well, then maybe it's time to build something else. He didn't say it then, but those words settled in him like roots under frost. They sat beside the ones Oliver had said weeks ago, after the third missed piano recital. "It's okay, Dad. I didn't expect you to come anyway." He stayed in Maplewood longer, didn't tell his assistant, hired a local nanny and signed Oliver up for a nature camp, started reading books that had nothing to do with mergers or forecasts. He stopped wearing suits, started showing up to the diner for dinner, not just coffee. One Friday night, the diner was nearly empty. A thunderstorm rolled in, and Ethan lingered longer than usual. Sadie leaned on the counter across from him, arms crossed, eyes soft. "Rainy nights like this, we used to lose power all the time," she said. "Mom would light candles and pretend it was a party. My sister and I would sneak cookies." Ethan smiled. "What happened to her, your sister?" Sadie's expression shifted, like someone had pulled a shade over her thoughts. "She left," she said. "Got married, moved to the city, haven't seen her in years." "New York." Sadie nodded. "What's her name?" She looked at him then, really looked. Something unreadable passed through her expression. "Her name's Rachel Calloway." The words knocked the breath out of him. Rachel. His ex-wife. He stared, unsure if he'd heard her right. "Rachel Calloway is your half-sister," Sadie said. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. "Different dads, same mom, you didn't know." Ethan leaned back slowly, his heart drumming hard against his ribs. "No," he said, "I didn't." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with years they'd both lived apart, filled with the sharp realization that the woman he'd been slowly, undeniably drawn to was connected to the one person he'd spent the last 3 years trying to forget. Sadie didn't say anything else. She just turned and walked away, disappearing behind the kitchen door as the storm outside roared louder. Ethan stayed seated, coffee cold, stomach churning with something that felt like the start of everything unraveling. And yet beneath it all, there was a weightless flicker of something else. Hope or ruin. He didn't know which yet. The next morning brought a crispness to the air that didn't match the weight pressing against Ethan's chest. Maplewood had dried off, puddles reflecting pale light under scattered leaves. He sat at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee, watching Oliver on the porch building something out of sticks and rubber bands. A camp project, apparently, one he hadn't asked for help with. Sadie hadn't answered when he called the diner that morning. A woman with a smoker's voice said she wasn't in, day off. He didn't ask for details, just hung up and stared at his phone like it owed him something. Rachel had never mentioned a sister, not once, not even in passing. Their marriage had been built on image, not intimacy. His ex-wife had been stunning, sharp, and deeply driven, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made it hers. But there had always been a wall, invisible and firm. She'd never wanted Maplewood, never visited the old house even once. She called it quaint in that way that meant suffocating. Sadie was none of that, and now she was tangled into his past in a way that changed everything. By noon, Ethan was at the edge of Cedar Pond, throwing rocks into the water. It had been his father's thinking spot, back when thinking wasn't something you scheduled between meetings. The water rippled under the weight of each stone. He didn't notice Sadie approaching until her boots crunched over the gravel path. "I figured you'd find your way out here," she said. Ethan stood, unsure what to say. The wind lifted her hair slightly, the sun lighting her profile like something sacred. She didn't look angry, just steady. "I didn't know," he said, voice low. "I believe you." "I wouldn't have," he hesitated. "Things wouldn't have gotten close if I'd known." Her eyes met his, and for a moment the quiet around them thickened. "But they did," she said. He nodded. They stood like that for a long time, neither one moving, as if the space between them was suddenly fragile. Finally, Sadie sat on a large rock and pulled her knees up. "I haven't seen Rachel in almost 8 years," she said. "Our mom was the only thread between us, and when she passed it all just unraveled. Rachel took her grief and turned it into distance." Ethan sat beside her, keeping a respectful space between them. "I met Rachel when she was already polished, a PR genius. She never talked about her past." "She was different with me too," Sadie said. But I still loved her, in the strange way you love someone you barely understand. I used to imagine we'd get older and find our way back to each other. Ethan thought of the day Oliver was born. Rachel had been efficient, even in labor. She refused to cry. When the nurse placed the baby in her arms, she'd held him like something delicate but foreign. Sadie tilted her face to the sky. I think part of me always assumed I'd stay invisible to her. That's the thing about being someone's secret, you forget how to expect anything else. He turned toward her then, letting her words sink in. You're not invisible to me. It wasn't a line, it wasn't meant to mean more than it did, but Sadie's breath caught just enough for him to notice. When she finally stood, she didn't leave. Instead, she held out her hand. Walk with me. They followed the path along the pond, talking quietly. Not about Rachel anymore or the past, but about Oliver. About the raccoon Sadie had found in her trash last week. About the dog she used to have and the notebook of recipes she kept under her bed because she was too afraid someone might tell her they were bad. And as the sun slipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the trail, something tentative began to shift. Not forgiveness, not desire, something gentler, recognition. Ethan didn't go back to the diner for 3 days, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't want to make her feel cornered. In the meantime, he focused on Oliver. They started waking up early and hiking the short trail behind the house. One morning, Oliver reached for his hand without being asked. The boy's fingers were cold and small, but he didn't let go for the whole walk. Ethan didn't bring up Sadie to Oliver, not yet. But one evening, as they roasted marshmallows in the fire pit out back, Oliver turned to him. That lady from the diner, he said, she makes you less grumpy. Ethan laughed genuinely. Is that right? Yeah, you smile more when she's around. You even listen to the guy fixing the roof without interrupting. I think that was just because he was holding a nail gun. Oliver smirked and Ethan ruffled his hair, warmth spreading through his chest in a way he hadn't felt in years. When he did return to the diner, it was late afternoon. The place was quiet, a few locals nursing coffee cups. Sadie stood behind the counter, arranging slices of pie in the glass display. When she looked up and saw him, she didn't look away. He sat down at the counter this time, close enough that their arms nearly touched when she leaned forward. I made lemon cream today, she said. You strike me as the kind of man who likes tart things more than sweet. You're not wrong. She served him a slice, then grabbed a fork for herself and leaned against the counter. I've been thinking, she said, maybe we're not doomed just because life is messy. Ethan met her eyes. Messy is generous. She laughed, true, but if we stopped doing things just because they might get complicated, we'd never get anywhere. There it was again, that steadiness, that way she had of taking the sharpness out of his thoughts. She didn't ask for promises, didn't pretend this was simple, but she was here and she was offering something fragile and real. They ate in silence, sharing a plate. At one point their forks touched and neither of them moved. That night Ethan lay awake listening to the crickets outside, Oliver breathing softly in the next room. He thought about how many things had been broken in the past few years. His marriage, his priorities, the version of himself he thought he was supposed to be. And yet here he was, in a town that wasn't supposed to matter, rebuilding something he hadn't even realized was lost. The past wasn't finished with him. Rachel would find out eventually, maybe even show up. But the future was here too, sitting across from him in a diner booth, telling stories about raccoons and baking lemon pie. He didn't know what would happen next, but he wanted to find out. Sunday came with a pale sun and the smell of damp earth. Ethan pulled into the parking lot of the diner just before the breakfast rush. Inside, the radio played something soft from the 70s, the kind of music you didn't recognize until the chorus pulled a memory loose. Sadie was already working the line, pouring coffee with a rhythm that spoke to muscle memory and distraction. When she saw him, her expression didn't change, but she slid him a smile anyway, one of those quiet, unspoken things that passed between people who were trying to figure out what they were building. He sat at the counter again. It had become a thing now, not quite theirs, but close. What's today's forecast? He asked. Hash browns and passive-aggressive locals, chance of sunshine if you're lucky. Her eyes flicked over his shoulder to the table of elderly men she was half ignoring. Someone left a church bulletin in the tip jar yesterday. I think it was a hint. I thought you weren't religious. I'm not, but the choir's decent, and I like the smell of old wood and candle wax. It reminds me of my mom. Ethan nodded, then watched her grab a pencil and pad. She moved like someone who never waited for anyone to make room for her. It was one of the first things he'd noticed. After she returned with a steaming plate of food, she lingered. I was thinking, she said, voice lower now, you and Oliver should come to the fall fair next weekend. He might like the hayrides. You'll be there. She smiled. I make the pie for the contest every year. Don't tell anyone, but mine's the only one worth eating. Ethan hesitated, then said, we'll come. He meant it. Later that night, he stood outside with Oliver, helping him glue together the last piece of a Pinewood Derby car. It was crooked, painted a terrible shade of orange, and absolutely perfect. As Oliver ran back inside for more stickers, Ethan glanced at his phone. A text from Sadie had come through half an hour ago. Hey, just a heads up, Rachel knows. That was it, no details, no punctuation. The calm before a storm. He didn't sleep much that night, not from fear but anticipation. He had always known there'd be a cost. You don't take comfort in someone like Sadie and expect the world to nod politely. Rachel called the next morning. Her voice was clipped, professional. I hear you've taken up with my sister. He stood in the hallway, half-dressed, the cordless phone tight in his hand. I didn't know who she was at first, he said, but yes. There was a pause. He could almost hear her calculating. You really think this is smart, with Oliver involved? I think this is the first thing that's felt real in years. You know she's not like us, Rachel said. She didn't grow up with rules, with expectations. She waits tables, Ethan. She raises plants, and people without pretending either are beneath her. That landed, he could tell by the silence on the other end. I don't care who you date, Rachel said finally, her voice flat, but don't bring her into our custody conversations. I never have, and I wouldn't. She hung up after that. That night, Ethan didn't tell Sadie about the call right away. Instead, he met her outside the diner after closing, hands in his pockets, breath visible in the cooling air. She reached out, he said. Sadie didn't flinch. I figured. She thinks this is reckless, dangerous even. For who? He looked at her then, probably for herself. Sadie exhaled. She always hated what she couldn't control, and I've never been interested in being told where I do or don't belong. I don't want to put you in the middle of something old and messy. She stepped closer, not touching him, but near enough that he felt it. I've been in the middle since I was born, Ethan. This time I get to choose where I stand. They didn't kiss, not then, but the distance between them finally felt less like a wall and more like a door that had already opened halfway. The next few days unfolded quietly. Oliver started asking questions about Sadie that had nothing to do with food. Does she like scary movies? She ever go sledding? Can she make pancakes that smile? Ethan answered what he could. They didn't talk labels, not yet. But on Wednesday, Sadie came over after dinner and taught Oliver how to make pie crust. He wore more flour than he used, and she laughed with the kind of ease that made the whole house feel warmer. After Oliver fell asleep, they sat on the back steps, a mug of tea between them. Rachel was always Mom's favorite, Sadie said, unprompted. I don't blame her. Rachel was brilliant. She didn't make mistakes the way I did. You think loving someone who walks away is a mistake. She looked at him then, eyes steady. No, but thinking they'll stay anyway might be. Ethan reached for her hand. It felt small in his, strong too. I'm not going anywhere. She didn't answer right away, just squeezed his fingers once, then let go. The town buzzed that week. Someone had spotted them holding hands outside the hardware store, and the rumors trickled faster than the falling leaves. No one said anything to his face, but a few glances lingered longer than necessary. At the fall fair, Oliver won second place in the ring toss and rode the hay wagon 3 times. Sadie's pie won a blue ribbon, and she gave the whole slice to Oliver, who declared it better than birthday cake. Ethan held her hand in public, not caring who noticed. Rachel didn't come, but Ethan found himself scanning the crowd anyway. That night, Sadie leaned her head against his shoulder, while they listened to a local band play off-key folk music near the bonfire. "You're not scared?" she asked. "I am," he said, "but I've lived a long time making decisions out of fear. I'd rather not anymore." She was quiet for a while, the firelight flickering in her eyes. "Then let's see where this goes." It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a vow. It was better. It was honest. The first snow came earlier than expected. It dusted the rooftops and softened the edges of the woods like the town had exhaled into winter without meaning to. Ethan stood at the edge of the porch, coffee in hand, watching Oliver chase flakes with his mouth open and arms spread wide. Sadie hadn't stayed over, not yet. There was still a quietness to the way they moved around each other, a kind of mutual patience that wasn't rooted in caution so much as respect. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. But they were becoming something. Over the next week, their lives wove tighter. She came over for dinner twice. Once she brought a box of old board games from her mother's closet and stayed long enough that Oliver fell asleep with his head on her lap, one hand tangled in her apron string. Another night, Ethan fixed the lock on the diner's back door while she reorganized the spice rack, humming something he didn't recognize but didn't want to forget. Still, it wasn't simple. Rachel called again the day before Thanksgiving. Her voice was measured, but there was a tremble beneath the words this time. "I've been thinking," she said, "about custody." Ethan sat in his truck outside the grocery store, one hand gripping the steering wheel. "What about it? I want to revisit the agreement." He closed his eyes, because of Sadie. "I'm not comfortable with her playing house with my son. Oliver isn't a pawn, Rachel. He's not yours alone, either." There was a pause. He could feel her reworking the conversation in real time, aiming for leverage, for control. "Just give me time with him over Christmas," she said finally. "More than the usual week. I'm not asking for full custody, not yet." Ethan almost said yes just to end the call, but something inside him pushed back. "I'll think about it," he said, and ended the call before she could say anything else. He didn't tell Sadie right away. That night she met him at the edge of the pond with a thermos of cider and a wool hat pulled low over her ears. They walked in silence, leaves crunching under their boots, the last golden scraps of fall fading into frost. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said as they reached the bench by the water. "You can ask me anything. Why did it end, you and her?" Ethan took a moment. The truth wasn't sharp or dramatic, it was slow, a kind of erosion. "She never wanted this life," he said. "Not the quiet, not the parenting, not the vulnerability. And I didn't know how to give her what she needed without losing who I was. We didn't break up in one moment, we just stopped choosing each other." Sadie nodded like she understood that kind of grief intimately. "I always wanted to ask her why she cut me off," she said. "We weren't close, but we weren't nothing. She didn't even call after the funeral." "Do you want to see her again?" "I'm not sure," she said. "I used to think I did, but now, maybe I just want to stop holding that question." They sat quietly for a while, no solutions, just space. The next morning, Ethan found Oliver sitting at the kitchen table drawing a crooked Christmas tree. The boy looked up with sleep-soft eyes. "Is Sadie coming to Thanksgiving?" Ethan poured orange juice into a glass. "Only if we invite her." "I want her to come," Oliver said. "She knows how to make the mashed potatoes not gross." That afternoon, Sadie arrived at the house with a tray of cornbread stuffing and a shy smile. Oliver opened the door before Ethan could. The way he grinned at her, like she was someone important, not just familiar, made something quiet and permanent settle in Ethan's chest. They ate by candlelight, not because it was fancy, but because the power flickered once and they didn't bother fixing the switch. Sadie helped Oliver fold napkins into crooked triangles, and Ethan caught himself watching her more than he watched the food. Later, after the dishes were rinsed and the boy was asleep, they stood in the kitchen, steam rising from mugs of decaf. I don't want to get in the way, Sadie said suddenly. You're not. If Rachel changes the terms, if she pushes for custody or makes this messy, I don't want to be the reason you lose time with him. Ethan stepped closer. You're not the reason, she is, and I'm done living my life trying to avoid her moods. But he's your son. And you're not just passing through. Her eyes met his, and this time they didn't look away. The silence held something steady between them, not a question, not a maybe. When he kissed her, it wasn't rushed. It didn't feel like something sudden or new. It felt like the inevitable end of a slow, quiet unfolding. She pulled back first, eyes searching his. I want this to be real, she whispered. Not a reaction, not a rebellion. It is. Outside, snow fell again, thicker now, clinging to branches and rooftops like it had nowhere else to go. That night, Sadie didn't go home. She stayed, curled beside him under a blanket on the couch, her hand tucked into his as the credits rolled on a movie neither of them finished. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The next morning, Oliver tiptoed into the living room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. When he saw Sadie still there, his face broke into something gentle and curious. You stayed. She sat up slowly, brushing a hand through her hair, just for breakfast. He nodded, satisfied. Okay, can we make pancakes? They did. With chocolate chips and syrup and the radio playing too loud, Ethan stood by the counter, watching them flip batter and argue about toppings. It felt absurdly domestic, messy, unplanned, impossibly whole. He didn't know what Rachel would do, whether the next court date would bring a storm or just more silence. But in that moment, with his son laughing and Sadie humming beside the stove, none of it seemed bigger than the life they were already building. There were things left unresolved, but the pieces were starting to find their place. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep choosing. December rolled in quiet and cold. The lake froze at the edges, and Oliver took to pressing pennies into the ice just to see how far down they sink before freezing over. He and Sadie started leaving notes for each other in the margins of recipe books and grocery lists, silly things, half-rhymes, inside jokes, a doodle of a pie with a smiley face. Ethan had never lived like this before, not even when he thought he was happy. The rhythm was slower now, grounded. Every morning brought small routines. Sadie setting the heat just a little higher than necessary, Oliver sneaking her an extra scoop of sugar in her coffee, Ethan making lunch with too much mustard and pretending it wasn't on purpose. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean. But it was theirs. Then 2 weeks before Christmas, the letter came. It arrived in a cream-colored envelope tucked between bills and a catalog. Ethan knew the handwriting before he even opened it, Rachel's sharp angles, her careful spacing. She didn't call this time, she didn't argue. She sent a formal notice through her lawyer, intent to petition for expanded custody. The holidays, the summer months, and shared weekends every month going forward. No accusations, no dramatic claims, just the cold, deliberate architecture of someone redrawing the lines. Ethan read it twice, then folded the paper neatly and slipped it into the kitchen drawer next to the corkscrew. He didn't tell Oliver, he didn't tell Sadie, not yet. That night he stood in the backyard under a sky scraped clean by the wind, watching the stars come through one by one. Sadie stepped outside barefoot, arms wrapped tight around herself. She didn't ask, just stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. She's making her move, he said after a long moment. Sadie looked out into the trees. I thought she might. I don't want to drag you into this. You're not dragging me, I'm walking in. He turned toward her then, taking in her face, softened by the dark, framed by strands of hair the wind hadn't caught yet. She's going to try to paint this like you're the threat, he said, like I've let someone unstable into my son's life. I've been called worse. That's not the point. I know, she reached for his hand, her palm cold against his. But I'm not going anywhere, Ethan. You don't have to protect me from this, just don't shut me out of it. He kissed her knuckles, and for the first time since the letter arrived, his shoulders eased. The next morning he sat Oliver down and told him the truth. Simple, steady, no panic. Mom wants to spend more time with you, he said, and we're going to figure out what that means together. Oliver listened carefully. Does that mean I won't be here as much? Maybe, but we'll make sure it feels okay, that you feel okay. The boy nodded slowly. Will Sadie still be here? If you want her to be. I do. That night they decorated the tree. Sadie brought a box of old ornaments from her mother's attic, mismatched things with peeling paint and bent hooks. Oliver hung them beside Ethan's sleek glass ones from the city. The result was lopsided, a little chaotic and perfect in its own way. The custody hearing was set for January, but Rachel called a few days before Christmas, her voice different this time, unsure, almost strained. I don't know what I expected, she said. Maybe I thought you'd fall apart, that you'd get angry, reckless, but you didn't. I'm not interested in fighting you, Rachel. You used to be. I used to be someone else. There was silence on her end. I talked to Oliver, she said. He told me you've been building forts in the woods and burning pancakes with someone who makes him feel safe. I think I hated hearing that at first, but now I'm just tired. Ethan didn't reply. I'm not withdrawing the petition, she said, but I'm willing to mediate instead, figure out something we don't both regret. That's all I want. I know. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't war either. It was a beginning of something less sharp. Christmas morning came with cinnamon rolls and mismatched socks. Sadie stayed the night before, sleeping beside him in the narrow bed after they wrapped gifts in silence. Oliver burst into their room before dawn, his arms full of wrapping paper and excitement, and neither of them told him to wait. Later they sat on the couch together, the boy nestled between them, watching a holiday movie with hot cocoa and too many marshmallows. Ethan looked over at Sadie. She was holding Oliver's hand, her other resting quietly on his knee. He didn't need to say anything, she already knew. This wasn't a fairy tale ending, it wasn't tied with a bow. But it was real, it was earned. And it was enough.